Welcome to Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by former world number one Laura Massaro and performance coach Ahad Raza.
We break down what's really happening in high-level squash across the technical, tactical, physical, and mental realms and help you translate it into action.
You will hear match analysis, guided insights, coaching demonstrations, and conversations with some of the best minds in sport.
But this isn't just about the theory. It's about growing a community of curious players and coaches dedicated to unlocking their potential together.
So if you're ready to train smarter, think deeper, and play better, join us Between the Lines. Welcome, everyone. We have Coach Tony Holler on the podcast joining us. And in fact, we just wrapped up the call and he spoke about some really interesting things. Now, for those who don't know, Tony Holler is a track coach out of Chicago, Illinois. He's worked with professional American football players. He's worked with soccer federations, football federations in France. He's travels around the world and educates people about speed and athleticism. So he's very knowledgeable and well-renowned track coach. Now, we just finished up a fantastic call with him, and we're going to give you a little snippet of what he discussed. Laura, what are some of the key things that stood out to you?
Well, I just loved our chat around how squash players can work a little bit more at intensity, at speed. Take one of the biggest things he talked about was not having two red days in a row, so two extreme hard days, which as a squash player was like, whoa, what?
Yeah.
So some really interesting chats just around that kind of workload and the intensity and how he would basically structure for a squash player. So we were obviously trying to bring it to squash as much as we could, and I think we got some really valuable insight. What about you?
I agree. I think gamification was a big one, and just general sort of mental approach and competitiveness and competition, I think, was a big one. So Coach Holler shares some really cool insights, folks. Stay tuned. You're going to dive into all of it in a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Between the Lines with Laura Massaro and me, Ahad Raza. Today, we have the infamous Coach Tony Holler, who is a phenomenal world-renowned sprint coach. He's a speed coach, he's an athletic coach, and I think he does a lot more than that. And actually, on that note, Tony, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about your philosophy? And I know you're primarily focused on speed, sprint, football, track, things like that. How do you think your philosophy applies to multi-directional sports and movements like squash, for example?
Yeah, I my excuse me, my background is really multi-sport. My father was a basketball coach, career basketball coach, and in the Midwest, if you're a head coach at a high school, you're like the most recognizable person in town. So it wasn't like it was his hobby. No, it was his absolute passion. And I don't think he ever went an hour without thinking about the next season, the next practice, the eighth grade kid that could dunk and, things like that. And so, but he also coached football and he coached tennis and he coached track and he had a huge baseball background where he played baseball well past college and all that kind of stuff. So I come from a multi-sport background. I was a head basketball coach for a long time. And I found myself in the last 35 years really anchored in track and field, which is probably because I was such a numbers guy. I was a chemistry teacher for 38 years, maybe the most quantified science in the world, where you basically, I used to tell my kids, we try stuff and we measure what happens, and then we come to conclusions. And so it really, that model of experimentation and trying things and writing things down and collecting data really influenced my track and field stuff, because everything in track and field is measured, whether you're throwing the shot putter, the discus, or jumping high or jumping far, or we're running fast or running fast over hurdles. We are always measuring all kinds of things, not just the end result, but how fast were we between the hurdles and things like that. So with that background, all of a sudden I developed some conclusions that the harder we worked and the longer we worked, the performance would decline, which flew in the face of modern thought. which, by the way, modern thought is also ancient thought as well, because we have not evolved athletically in this country. We have just every single winner, whether it's an athlete or a coach, every single one of them will tell you they outworked the competition. And so what that did was create these 2 hour track practices for kids. There were kids that got hurt because the dosage was too high. By the way, number one cause of injury is dosage. And people just thought, well, these kids are soft these days. They aren't tough like they were back in my generation when we had to wake up at 5 in the morning and do chores. Um, but it wasn't softness. It was just stupid training and not meeting kids where they were. So my ideas of dosage started people from other sports, whether it's football, lacrosse, squash, uh, soccer. I spoke in Ireland last summer where hurling coaches wanted to hear my ideas. So it really comes back to dosage and maximizing performance and collecting data and creating practices that are not just hard, but
Right.
instead practices that are fun and actually get you somewhere.
And Tony, like how do you respond to people where they say, well, look at this person, look at this athlete, and they're the phenom, they're the world number one, and or look at this country that's producing all of these athletes and they're all going through the grind. How do you respond to that? Because people want to follow success, right? They say success leaves clues. How do you, yeah, how do you respond to that? People want to emulate that.
Well, it takes hours of me talking, but I can convince people. I really can. I remote trained a Swedish soccer player who was arguably the fastest kid in Sweden at the age of 15. And he was a great soccer player as well. And his goal was to play at the professional level. And so he started watching videos of Kobe Bryant, who was the great player for the Los Angeles Lakers. He was blessed by having a dad who was an NBA player and a mom that was athletic. And he had a lot of blessings. But to hear him talk, it was because he woke up at 4 o'clock every day and shot the ball 10,000 times before anybody else ever woke up.
Yep.
And so this kid took the Mamba mentality and he got stronger, slower, and injured.
Mm.
And it was really through remote training with me that we tried to recreate him into an athlete that was fast and explosive and loved the game again,
Yeah.
which I think is so important. But yet, like you say, we're just fed this stuff constantly, that it's all the volume and the amount of work. And I'm much more of an essentialist. I did not read Essentialism to begin my ideas, but Essentialism confirmed my ideas. It's a short book, and everybody should read it. It's by a great guy named Greg McKeown, Mckeown. And basically, it's learning how to prioritize and focus on what matters and not try to do everything in every direction, but instead find the direction that creates results and then limit that. My dad, who was very old school, used to say quality over quantity. And every coach says that. And then every coach does the opposite.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a question on that though. So on that, when you think about that outworking your opponent, so to speak. I mean, I know that I've probably been guilty of saying that, my sort of motto in a way was a little bit differently, but my motto when I was playing was leave no stone unturned. I wanted to finish my career and retire. No matter what I achieved, I wanted to know that I had done everything that I possibly could. But for me, particularly as I matured and learned a little bit, got that a little bit more experience, I started to realize, I think personally, I just wanted to get your take on this, that outworking your opponent for me didn't always mean physical work. It was almost like outsmarting your opponent. So can you do that technical work on the video that's actually quite slow and not that tiring at all in some ways? Can you do the foam rolling at the end of the day? Can you get regular massage? Can you do video analysis on your opponent? Can you watch matches? Can you do your sports psychology? Can you do your visualization? Can you do all of these little things that are actually not tiring at all, but significantly outworking your opponent, if that makes sense?
Totally. And that is a totally a feed the cats approach, which is my brand and stuff. And that what we're talking about here is it's not the amount of hard work that you do. And I had a lacrosse guru, and a guy named Jamie Monroe tell me one time that you need to stop giving the message that you're anti-hard work.
Yeah.
Instead, give the message that you're trying to redefine hard work.
Yeah. I love
And
that.
what you're talking about is redefining hard work.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
the amount of hours with
Yeah.
squash. It's the amount. I have a pyramid of success. I kind of stole the idea of a pyramid from John Wooden, a great basketball coach from UCLA,
Yeah.
where my bottom layer of my pyramid is rest, recovery, sleep, nutrition. Those are not easy things. It
Yeah.
is not, it's not easy for my high school track athletes to go to sleep by 9:30 at night in order to get 8 hours of sleep. But my guys do that, and that has paid off maybe more so than anything we do on the track.
Yeah.
That sleep is hard,
Yeah.
nutrition is hard. I tell
Yeah.
people say, "What are your ideas on nutrition?" I say, "Eat like a man, eat like an adult. Don't eat candies and cookies. Eat meat and potatoes and vegetables. Drink water, not Coke." So
Yeah.
these are not really hard ideas,
Yeah.
but it's hard to be consistent with the athletic way, with the athletic mindset. So what you're talking about is exactly what I preach. And so much of the actual work that you do needs to be evaluated. Like, does this hour of work really help me to win?
Yeah.
And so many sports coaches, I could go watch their practice and say 50% of the stuff that you did was BS. It will never move the needle. You're
Yeah.
you're you're slogging through third gear type of activity, trying to play a fifth gear sport.
Yeah.
What are you doing? But yet we're just such prisoners of the way it's always been done. We tend to want to coach the way we were coached. And all
Yeah.
those things are things that need to be evaluated, but coaches don't because coaches have to be confident. And
Right.
to be confident is also being stubborn. And so it's a fun debate to get back and forth with coaches that are old school.
Yeah, I had an interest as you were speaking, I was thinking about you're almost coming from a values-based approach where the values are quality commitment, it's hard work. It's hard work, but smart work. It's consistency. It's so I'm thinking values-based approach, which to me is actually really powerful. The other thing that you mentioned, which I was curious about, you mentioned, people are training in third gear for, playing sports that require fifth gear. So how about sports that require a combination of both? So something that requires long distance third gear, but needs that rev up to fifth gear and sixth gear for those sprints. Like, soccer, you're a midfielder, you have to consistently be moving in that aerobic base, but then you have to make those hard sprints to join the attack occasionally. How does the training philosophy transfer over to a sport like that, for example?
Well, I think the most challenging sport in that regard is the sport of soccer. And uh, my views of soccer are really bother people because I believe that soccer itself, the playing of the game and the practicing of the game, should prepare you for the demands of the game. So if you really look at what a soccer player does, and I think we can translate this to almost any sport, is that over 50% of the movement in a soccer, oh yeah, you may run 6 miles, but you really don't run 6 miles. You walk and kind of fast walk and jog about 3 of those miles. That does not take, in my opinion, that does not take supplementation. You do not have to go out and run 6 miles every morning to be a good soccer player. Many people think you do, but I think that that running of 6 miles detrains the most important parts of soccer, which is that that 5% of the time that you hit close to max velocity. You say, well, shouldn't you train the 95% and not the 5? And I said, no, I think the 5 is what wins games. And so there's things, well, getting back to the soccer thing, when soccer coaches argue about the aerobic base, aerobic engine, all that kind of stuff, I always say, describe your best player. And when they say the first word out of their mouth, fast, second, explosive. And then I say, do you think marathon runners are fast and explosive? Well, no. I said, well, you're detraining the skills. I say you're running the cat out of guys. The cats are athletes, they're assassins, they're competitive.
Yeah.
You're running the cat out of your best athletes by supplementing with aerobic engine stuff. And this is really controversial. But in textbooks, they say without a great aerobic engine, like 6 months of aerobic work, that you will not be able to repeat fifth gear activities in a sport. And what I have found, and several people like me, is you should try to only focus on athletic stuff and see how fit you become. That what we have found were when you supplement with my 4 athletic things, sprint, lift, jump high, jump far, and bounce, when those are your supplementations instead of distance running or 30 minutes of stadium stairs, what you find is that you create better athletes. And I believe, strongly believe, that great athletes do not fatigue like slow, lesser athletes. And if we are making athletes less athletic by developing this mythical aerobic engine, I think we're detraining the qualities that make them a great squash player or a great
Yeah.
lacrosse player, a great soccer player.
I have a question, just obviously I think this is a bit more from like an athlete question. So I was working actually with a sprint coach for quite a while, and I found it amazing actually. And which I'd love to get your take on this probably as a second question, just about whether or not squash as a sport that is it is moving in a straight line obviously, but there's bends, there's curves, there's all different patterns on the court. And it's often referred to as a sprint marathon. Oh, it's certainly a repeated sprint sport. And I found working with the sprint coach unbelievable, actually, just in terms of relationship between the floor and the feet, getting into certain body positions, lifting in certain body positions was unbelievable. But there got to be a crossover point where I said to him at one point, I actually don't feel aerobically good enough to do squash like well for some of the matches at the moment. The physicality, as with every sport, is going up and up in um, squash, and so some of these women's matches are the minimum is now 50 minutes, and it's when you talk about soccer, there is no walking. You get a 10 to 15-second break between rallies and you're in again, and it's full speed, but it's over that hour. And I one of the things the sprint coach said to me when it was like, okay, send me your heart rate data. So I sent him it, and he could not believe the zones that were held at that highest level of sort of like an hour's worth, that was between kind of like that 165 to max basically for an hour. And the only time it ever really dropped is when you get your 2 minutes between games. And it's obviously that can happen 2, 3, 4 times, whatever the game score is. So I think it was just that question from, probably, if we've got squash players listening to this, how do you think about it when it comes to like heart rates? Do you think about heart rates when you're training, and how does that relate into that side of it?
I don't think much about heart rates because heart rates are so different individually.
Yeah,
Uh,
true.
when I ran college track and field, heart rates were really important in the late 70s. That was like the cutting edge stuff. And
Yeah,
I noticed that a group of like 8 sprinters could run like a 200 repeat or something, and my pulse would be over 200, and theirs would be 170.
yeah,
I just had the ability for my heart to beat faster, and
yeah,
other people
yeah,
beat slow. So I have a hard time with comparative heart rates.
yeah.
Um, what I believe is this, that when I'm talking about supplementation of squash, the sprint, lift, jump high, jump far, bounce, those things are not a huge investment. I think it's a priority, but it's never the majority of your work. To do proper sprint training twice a week is all you need. You could do, I have something called the atomic speed workout that you can do in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And if you do it twice a week, I say speed grows like a tree, so you have to water it like year round.
Yeah.
If you do that, you will get faster. And getting faster does not just mean getting faster in a straight line. This is so important. Sprinting is the most neurologically challenging thing we do. The CNS has a ceiling, and when we sprint and get faster, the ceiling goes up. What that does is several different things. One thing it does is create a speed reserve, which in a way is an alternative way to get in shape. That if your fast movements playing squash are not your ceiling, if you can do stuff sub-maximally and still be faster than your opponent, that's really good. That's
Yeah.
really good. If you can be tired and still be faster than your opponent,
Yeah.
that's really good.
Well, I also watched one of your videos as well, where you said if you're working at like 80% of your max speed, everything seems slow, right? Rather than
Yes,
working at 100% of what is 80% of your best, or, and that
yes,
was huge for squash. Being able to think and see the ball a little bit slower while still moving fast is game-changing stuff, really.
it is. And that's called speed reserve.
Yeah.
That the higher your ceiling, the higher your floor. And when you are tired, you only go down to your floor. But if your floor is still high
Yeah.
because you've been trained as an athlete instead of a marathon runner, that's good. And then here's the kicker. The CNS, when the CNS improves, everything improves.
Just clarify what CNS is.
Central nervous system,
Yeah.
that I say that sprinting is electrical more
Yeah.
than muscular,
Yeah.
that it is the lightning bolts of nerve impulses flying to the muscles, quick contractions, quick
Yeah.
relaxations, and coordinated contract relax. And what that does, we learn by stories. I had a good friend that trained two terrific high school golfers, females, and they thought they were going to be trained in golf specific ways, like swinging heavy things or something. He goes, no, 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 no. We're going to train you like an NFL running back. We're going to train you by sprint, lift, jump, bounce. And it seemed weird to them because they go, wait, wait, wait. In golf, we don't sprint, we don't lift heavy things, we don't jump, and we don't bounce. How is that going to make us a better golfer? And he said, your CNS will improve and your athleticism will improve, and that will improve other qualities. What happened is this. They had never been trained, so they improved a lot in 10 weeks, 2 miles an hour faster, that's incredible improvement. Their club speed improved 15 miles an hour. The
Wow.
speed at which they could swing a
Yeah.
club.
Yeah.
So here's my idea is that as we get faster, everything in squash may slow down.
Yeah.
Even cognitive things. I'm involved with a scientist in Paris. I spent 6 days with him. We're actually looking to have a grant approved by the French government where we will improve the cognitive improvements by getting faster.
Yeah.
Where where the possibility of fast things slowing down because our brain has learned to fire quicker is something that we want to study, and it may actually happen. We're waiting on the grant to be approved. We all know that everybody who's ever been a writer or a student tells you your brain works better after a 20-minute walk.
Mhm.
It fires up. What our idea is, what if we did extreme movement? What would that do to brain function? And we kind of think we know, but that's
Yeah.
science, right? We think we know, so we're going to test it, data, and make conclusions.
Well, it's interesting as well, Tony, just anecdotally speaking from my personal experience and then as a coach as well. Over the last several months with some of my students, we've shifted away from our traditional warm-ups, which would, be a lot of jogging and moving and, stuff like that, into just more sprint stuff. So A skips, a bunch of pogos, different kind of, imaginary box jumps, a lot of stuff that you show in the atomic workout as well. And one of my students in particular is coming to my mind, a 13-year-old girl, and she said, I just feel more ready to go, right? And she feels like she's quicker, she feels like her brain's ready to go. And personally, from my own experience as well, like I'm 39 years old now, and over the last few years, I've adjusted my training a lot to doing a lot of what you're speaking about. I'm lifting heavier, I'm trying to manage my dosing a little bit more appropriately, focused a lot more on jumping and gradually working on my sprint speed. I don't want to hurt myself by going too fast too soon. And I find that I actually did a solid 4 week chunk recently, and I found that my movement on court has gotten faster. I feel like I'm reacting better to the ball. I feel the endurance part, I haven't had a tough enough match against someone who's better than me to test that, that top end of the endurance side. But against people around my own standard, I'm feeling better on court, which goes to support your hypothesis.
Yeah, I say this is a controversial thing I say. My dad used to say, we're going to make practice so hard that the games are easy.
Yes.
And everybody thought that was brilliant. But I'm like, if you really think about it, if everything is really hard all week, are you entering the game as your best self?
Mhm.
And I don't think you are. I think you're diminished. And so my saying is let the game be hard. In other words, I would never train a marathon runner by having him run 30 miles a day.
Mhm.
We run shorter and we prioritize health and we gradually build for the marathon. But even then, the longest run by a novice marathoner is 20 miles. You don't ever run the full 26. So in a way, you're letting the marathon be hard because if you practice the hard, you are so diminished every single day. I mean, like if you go 30-mile run, you're not ready to run 30 miles the next day. And,
Right.
and so I think that we can take those ideas and plug them in. I also say let the game train the game. That oh you may need to do certain agility type of supplementation, but I think that comes in practice. I think if your practices do not prepare you for squash, you got to say what in the hell are you doing in practice?
Yeah.
And so this whole idea that we have to prepare for the hardness of a long, intense a match in squash is I think the wrong way to think. Instead, let's train at a really high level for maybe 50 to 60% of the dosage of a full game,
Mhm.
but then become very accustomed to that, very accustomed to playing at that high level for shorter than full periods of time.
Mhm.
And then let the game be hard. Allow yourself to get tired and fight through it. At least your ceiling will be so much higher than the
Mhm.
person you're playing against. But then again, if the person is a natural phenom, you're not going to beat them anyway.
Yeah.
So what when so say you say 50-60% you're thinking like shorter but more intense. If you were a squash player listening to this and you're going, hold on a second, I'm training for let's call it a nice round hour. My matches are roughly an hour. My training is 90 minutes, twice a day, 4 or 5 days a week of that with maybe one session that's a sprint session, one session that's maybe two half days that are a light session. And this was what, to be honest, I think squash players are I got told this a lot, and I think it's improving slowly. But if you think about the workload as a traffic light system, as in like you're working really hard, that obviously we know you can't sustain for an hour and a half, and that's your red zone. Then you've got your ambers, which is just that grind, and then you've got your green zone, which is your recovery or your light sessions. Squash players get caught a lot just in that amber. There's very little green and there's very little red because that's what that, and I grew up like that. And it was only probably from about 26, 27 that I started to realize I'm actually tired. I'm playing tired a lot. And it started to be like, you need to be in your red way more than you are. And as a squash player, you're thinking, but I'm training hard. I'm really training hard, and you are, but just not intensely. So what would the breakdown look like from your perspective as a squash player? You're training for that hour to hour and a half match. If you think of it, I don't know if you've got a better kind of analogy or comparison for that traffic light system where you might go, okay, what would that breakdown look like in terms of an athlete that's training twice a day, 6 days a week, let's say, for squash?
Well, you probably know my answer. I think that's way too much.
Yeah.
One of my sayings is never let today ruin tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think most people understand that if you have a really tough game, you don't practice hard the next day.
Mhm.
Your body needs to recover. Well, what if your practices are harder than games? And it's back to back to back to back, that you are just in a state of decline. Oh, yeah, you can pat yourself on the back and say, I'm working hard, I'm outworking everybody. But you're susceptible to injury. Your brain is getting worn down. You don't love the training. You got to instead of get to train. The
Mhm.
only one letter is the difference between got to and get to.
Yeah.
You need to look forward to training. And once you develop this love of training, I think it's easier to stay in those reds. It's interesting that you use that traffic light thing. I color code all my track workouts as yellow, green, yellow, red, yellow, green. Red are meets, and they are what we call lactate workouts, the hardest thing we do, where we learn to sprint further by doing things like 3 200s at at like really getting after it, timed, spiked up, only 4 minutes rest. Our guys are all in the fetal position afterwards. We've extended this pain and suffering that usually happens in 50 seconds run the 400 into
Yeah.
like a 10-minute period. It
Yeah.
is torture and it makes us better. But our red days are always followed by a green day. Red to me is passion and danger. You
Yeah.
know, and as you say, that's what wins for you. But you
Yeah.
cannot go, the reds have to be protected.
Yeah.
Protected by your previous practice and the recovery after that practice.
Yeah.
And so I'm a believer in doing hard things as long as we protect it before and after.
Yeah.
Now, green to me is an off day, and I think off days are important mentally as much as they are physically.
Yeah.
That that when we develop a love of our sport, we don't have to be pushed anymore. We feel pulled.
Yeah.
That's a Steve Jobs quote, and I
Yeah.
just love it. That we want to let the mission pull us.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
too many times, this top down, if you want to be good, this is what you do. You don't have to, dedicate your life to this. It's going to be hard work. You're going to hate it sometimes, and you just got to get up and do it. That does not create love of sport.
No.
It really doesn't. Oh, and then it's kind of weird. My yellow days don't just mean like third gear at all. Actually, we go hard in our yellow days, but we're cautious,
Yeah.
cautious with
Interesting.
dosage. So in a way, my color scheme's a little different than yours. Your yellow to you is more like moderate activity, and I think that is the curse. I
Yeah.
don't think a great track coach named Bill Bowerman once said, moderate exercise never produces extreme results.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's
Yeah.
what you're saying. There's
Yeah.
too much of this moderate exercise. So my yellow days are more like we are going to do our speed drills and then we're going to time 3 sprints less than 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go home. And my kids are going to be like, is that all? I go,
Well, do you know what's interesting? When I was doing speed work as a squash player, the one thing my S&C slash trainer would say was, you're going to hate this because you're going to feel like you're not working hard. It's
oh,
like sprint
love it.
for sprint for the 10 to 20 seconds and then rest for 3 minutes. And I'm like, when am I going to do that on a squash court? I'm not doing, I'm walking around, looking at my watch, like I'm used to going. Um, but my only, sorry to, I know you'll have a follow-up question but just one thing. So just because I know that this will be a mentality of some of the squash players watching, particularly competitive ones, How do you switch your mentality if that's the case for that kind of always following a red day with a green day? If you've got, so currently I'm working with a few pros to make it to the final, they have to be playing 4 matches in a row, day after day. So what if your first round is in the red and you've not trained for the second, third, fourth day to be in the red? There's generally depends on the event, not a load of rest days. So yeah, just I know from a playing perspective, I would be like, if I haven't trained hard for 5 days or 4 days in a row, depending on the size of the event, how am I going to get that confidence up going into the latter stages of that event?
And what you bring up is something that I think is a great point from old school coaches is confidence. Like
I'm youngly retired. I'm not an old school coach. I've clearly been coached by an old school coach.
there you go. We're all old school. Anyway, but the idea that the harder you work, the more you feel like you deserve success
Yeah,
when you get tired. Like because I've outworked this guy, I'm going to beat him late in the game. That is a wonderful confidence is wonderful. So we do have to change the way people think. There are people that ask me if you never have 2 red days in a row, what happens in our state track meet when we have to run, say a great runner runs 4 events on Friday, he has to do it again on Saturday. He's never done that in his life. Doesn't that kid fall apart? And what I've found is that they run faster on the second day. Part of that is because it's the game. There's 25,000 people in the stands. There is excitement. They're in the championship. And I say, let the game, the magic of the game, carry you. And instead of saying, I have run more miles than my opponent, say that I am faster, stronger, and I love the game more than my opponent.
I'm
And what
probably healthier
happens,
too.
oh,
Yeah.
please, you are healthier. And that healthy is healthy mentally, healthy physically. It's a love of the game and an avoidance of injuries. There's nothing worse than hard training followed by 6 weeks of inactivity because
Yeah.
you got injured.
Or
And
ill.
Tony,
Yeah.
yeah, I had so one question that sometimes I hear people talk about is around the concept of periodization. So sometimes people say that it's effective almost to deliberately overreach without dipping into overtraining mode. So do you what I have an idea of what you're going to say, but what's your take on this concept of deliberately overreaching for 2 or 3 week blocks and pushing yourself in the red and the red and the red, and you give yourself a taper week before a big event.
It's one of my favorite subjects. It all began with the Soviets, and it was a 4-year plan, which
Yep.
kind of changes things a little bit. If if you have 4 years between Olympic appearances, maybe you can actually depress performance for a year and focus on just beating yourself up, just creating the capacity to do more work. And so in periodization, there's this overreach, and they will tell you that performance will decline because of that. Of course it does, because we're tired, beat up, we hate it. But then when we back off and start training like we're supposed to, performance goes up, and that's the taper. And so my crazy idea is, well, what if you just did the performance stuff? What
Mm.
if you took away that year of BS? What if you spent 4 years becoming faster, stronger, higher jumper, more explosive, all that? Wouldn't that serve you better? When people say, well, does my track team taper? I say my entire season is a taper. We are we are keeping doses as minimal as we can. Even if it's to a fault, we will keep it minimal, because right now I have 80 track athletes and 79 of them are running in my track meet tonight.
Oh,
79 out of 80. I have one weird hamstring tweak type of thing. He went to a pediatrician and the doctor said take 6 weeks off, don't do anything, and then they said jog for 2 weeks. Things that no professional football team, professional baseball team, professional basketball team, that's not the way we rehab athletes. It's like we are going to work our butt off for 6 weeks. We're not going to re-injure that hamstring,
Yeah.
but we are not going to like lay in bed like we're a grandmother or something. And so those injury things are just so important. Availability is really, I mean, like, you can really control injuries if you're focused on dosage and meaningful prioritized work.
Yeah. There was one other thing that you said that I thought was very interesting earlier, where you said training prepares you for the sport. And when you were talking about that, I think when I, as a coach now, I try to structure my practices. Well, even as a player now, as a player and as a coach, I structure my practices in a way where we're hitting different energy systems, different movement patterns, different things within the drill or within the sequence of a session. So sometimes people go out and they train without any purpose. There's no intention in their training. But if you know what you're trying to set out and achieve, you can actually work on those specifics. So whether it's a timed drill, whether you want to build that confidence for your lactate long threshold, for example, you could set a timer for 2 minutes, like, if you want to be savage and work for at full intensity or close to full intensity for 2 minutes, working certain patterns of movement. So I think sometimes that aerobic conditioning side or that off-court conditioning side of it can be attacked through intelligent programming when it comes to session structure, in my opinion.
Practice better prepare you for the game. I mean, like,
Yeah.
we, like, who would argue with that, right?
Yeah.
And for anybody that acts like you have to do all this supplementation in order to prepare your people to play in the game, I'm like, well, what in the hell are you doing in practice? You need to
Yeah.
reevaluate. You're stuck. Experiment with different things. I think that one of the things I talk about is gamifying practice,
Mhm.
which really to me means a couple different things. One is it better resemble the game. If it's not reflective of the game, you're out thinking yourself. Like, it better resemble the game and prepare for the game. But also, you can do small segments. Because I don't have a squash background, I'll give you a basketball scenario.
Yep.
Um, if you want your kids to play hard, put 2 minutes on the clock in practice and put the score as 71-65,
Yeah.
and your five starters are behind by 5 with 2 minutes to go. There's no better way to work on the press. There's no better way to create intensity, and there's no better way to create fun. That's what we live with. So if we could create little games inside of practice, um, another way to gamify practice is to measure.
Mhm.
It's pretty easy in track and field because we're sprinting and throwing and jumping and things like that. But there's little things like Patrick Mahomes, famous quarterback in the NFL. Every time he swings a lead pipe, they measure the miles per hour. Every
Mhm.
time he throws a medicine ball, underhanded, overhanded, twisting, miles per hour. They have a radar gun, and and so he is gamified all of his training. We would we would never anything that can be measured for my track team is measured. We don't say jump high. We
Mhm.
say jump high, and we're going to measure it. We don't say jump far. No, we get out the jump mat and we see how far people can go and we write it down. We don't say run fast. We time people running fast. So those are ways we gamify as well. And you say, well, squash isn't really like track though. But I think that if you start thinking about it, you
Well,
might be able to
I'll
figure some
interrupt
stuff
you for a
out.
second because you're absolutely right. There are certain I gamify some of these drills where we'll say, okay, from this position on the court, how quickly can you hit 30 consecutive shots, for
Perfect.
example, right? And then all of a sudden you have this challenge, you're trying to beat your previous time, you're trying to see is my technique at high quality even when I have this pressure on me to execute this skill. So I completely agree with you, and I think it works really, really well with juniors, like junior athletes. I think adults can probably benefit from it as well, especially professional players, but maybe they think it's too hokey pokey or too gamified. But Laura, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on
Yeah.
that too.
I mean, it was interesting. So, like I said, towards the back end of my career, which coincidentally was when I won all of my major titles, by the way. So I wasn't particularly an early starter. I was like 28, 29 before I really got up to kind of winning your big world championships. World number one, I was like 32. I was kind of late. When you consider the squash players of now, there's some like 21-year-olds in the top four in the world. It's ridiculous. But I started after I'd worked with the sprint coach, and I sort of then I think I found my happy zone of I understood how that worked, and then I went to a new strength and conditioning coach called Mark Campbell. He's New Zealand, he's Kiwi, so and he played squash and he understood squash. He understood how it felt, which was huge for me. But he said to me, and what was great, he knew my game. So before he even walked in the gym, he knew how I played the game and all of this sort of stuff, so which is crucial for kind of just that confidence for me. And he'd say, you're a player who's brilliant, got great endurance. You'll always outlast your opponent, but you're always working at that moderate level. What I want you to do, we're going to break down. We're going to get in the gym. We're going to do five games. Let's call them games, circuits, effectively. And I want you to get to the point where you're finishing set five slower than set one. I couldn't do it. I could not do it. My fourth and fifth were always the quickest. And he's just banging his head against the brick wall for months. And he's like, Laura, you're not going quick enough in the first one if your fourth and fifth are like, you know what I mean? And I'm like, yeah, but I need to be quick in the fourth and fifth because what if I get to a fourth and a fifth game?
Yeah.
And he's like, you'll have them off in three games.
Yeah.
I love
So,
it.
oh, the mental shift was just for a squash player, that track and field, you can always finish your 400 the quickest though, can't you? Well, there's something tells me you're not running quick enough for the first five if your sixth is the quickest. But as a squash player, it is some hurdle to get your head round because you just think I'm gonna have nothing left when I really need it. But what I slowly but surely start to say, and I know you'll know this already, Tony, but I'm sort of saying it a bit more hopefully for the people who are listening, was I got to a point where I would have a really hard first game. I'd probably nick it in the end because it was hard, and I'd nick it because I would be used to it. And then I'd win the second and third quite comfortably. It was almost like I blew them away in the first game with the pace and the intensity that I set out at. And then Mark would say to me, the only people that will match you for this pace will be the other players right around your ranking. So if I'm like two in the world, the one and the three, the four in the world, maybe will be able to match you. Then it's going to be who executes the plan, who's got the willpower, who's got the drive, who just plays better on them big points at the big moments. And that's on you guys. That's squash. So and it was totally true. The only other time for the squash players listening, the only other time that it really came in was when I was playing Raneem El Walili, Nour El Shabini, and then it's just like, can I get it right in these big moments? Which is a bit different because it's gameplay and it's making mistakes and making choices at the right time. But I absolutely can see how what you're saying kind of I would love to have given it a go more towards even what you're saying, but I think I got there more towards the end of my career, um, which was great.
Did you find when you played those elite athletes that you can it kind of magically energizes you
Yeah,
that there's magic in
yeah.
big games?
Yeah, and one of the biggest things when you're saying about that kind of when you have your green days and your red days, you have that you want to do your red days more. For me, it was am I inspired at the moment or am I motivated? And I use that so much in my career between inspiration versus motivation. And motivation is that I've got to get myself to the court, I've got to train, my opponents will be doing it. When I'm inspired, I'm on a mission with, I'm improving, I'm getting faster, I'm getting stronger. My energy is whole, my everything is going towards rather than fear of what's coming behind. And that I don't know how you can necessarily teach that. It's almost like you say, freshness is one, excitement, getting ready to go to the court, wanting to improve, seeing the numbers go up as an athlete, right? You see your numbers go up, it's very hard not to be inspired, isn't it?
Yeah, and you make a difference between inspiration and motivation. And I don't know if I've made that difference. To me, it's kind of like the same thing. There's a book called The Motivation Myth by
Yeah.
Jeff Hayden that can be summed up by just one sentence. We become motivated by seeing progress. You could substitute inspired. Like we
Yeah.
become
Yeah.
inspired by seeing progress. So I think it's up to the coach, and this is once again the gamification of our practices, where we have measurables, where we have success and failure, where we win and lose in practice. And I think athletes are, I shouldn't use the word addicted because it's a negative word, but we thrive on competition. We thrive on winning and losing. That both things become very important to us. And I think that you talk about how do you get there, and I think that's where the coach comes in too. That we reflect each other. If I'm the coach and you're the athlete, when you come in bouncy and excited to work, you make me a better coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think I'm responsible for getting you to come in bouncy and excited. And there's this wonderful reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
With good coach athlete relationships, the bad ones are the people who have to push the athlete when they really don't want to do it. The great sprint coach, Charlie Francis from Canada, said that the great athletes do not have to be pushed. They have to be held back. They're what they want to do is actually more than they should do. They
Yeah.
want to burn the stake.
Yeah.
And a great coach says, no, if I could keep a consistent inspiration with my athletes where they are healthy and inspired and they love it. Love is toughness, really. I mean, no, people will fight to the death for things they love.
Yeah.
If you don't love what you're doing, you're like, okay, let it go. and
Yeah.
and so that's where a coach has to come in. And this whole mindset that more is always better is just it's just wrong.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. Tony, I think that's probably a good spot, man. I think we've had a really solid conversation. I think we really, really appreciate your time. We appreciate your wisdom. It's really cool to bring this segue between, track and field, sprint, different perspective. But, interestingly enough, we were all essentially speaking the same language, which is really, really cool. So I think this was great. Laura, any final thoughts as well on your end?
I've just really enjoyed and the chat. I feel like I'm going to send this podcast out to a few trainers, maybe old school trainers. No, I'm joking. A few trainers, but also interestingly, maybe a few players themselves. Because like if you listen to this and it resonates, and there's something inside me is sort of saying, I wish I'd given that a go actually, and just see, obviously as a squash player, you're like, oh, but what if it doesn't work? But what if it does work? What if you're injury free? What if you're quicker? What if you're better? And maybe there might be a few squash players sending it hopefully out to their own strength and conditioning trainers just to kind of go, why don't you look into this a little bit more? And injuries are obviously one of the biggest motivators in terms of trying to get players invested. If you can get a player invested in, you're going to be less injured and more healthy, less ill. I think they're onto something. So thank you for opening up my eyes a little bit more, even more so than they already were on that side. And I really enjoyed the chat.
Now you're both of you are obviously already very progressive, but you talk about sending this to the old school people. It is just so important in everything we do to hear alternative opinions, you know. It,
Absolutely.
and we either have to say, okay, he's right, we're going to do it his way, or you have to defend yourself. This is why what I'm doing is right, which
Yes.
is good for us.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
hopefully we'll just get people testing new things as well, and then they can decide for themselves.
Yes, experimentation as a coach is so underrated because if you're not experimenting, what are you doing?
That's
You're
right.
doing what you did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yep.
And no program is correct. Like the best of everything should be in our future, not in our past.
Love it.
Love it.
All right, Tony. Thanks again, man. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Cheers. Folks, that was awesome with Coach Tony Holler. We're going to give you a few practical takeaways that you can apply to your own training and your own game. So one of the things that stood out to me was Coach Holler's suggestion around gamification and gamifying practice. So to me, one of the things that I love doing, which I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to repeat, is create a little challenge for yourself, whether it's hitting a particular number of consecutive shots within a certain period of time. So it could be volleys on the forehand and the backhand, turn by turn, from the short line. How many can you hit within 30 seconds? And if you know, okay, I hit 20 within 30 seconds, now you know next time I'm going to try to go for 21. And the next time 22. And it also gives you a pretty good indication of how your technique breaks down under pressure. So I think that's one of the, and your mindset, in fact, can you stay focused? So that's one of the things that I would highly suggest you take away. The other one around this would be almost doing mini games. So a lot of people struggle in certain phases of games. For example, if you're 9-all in the fifth or 9-all in any game, people often shift into outcome-based thinking instead of remaining focused on their process. So I would encourage you to maybe do a best out of 7 or a best out of 9, but starting at 9-all, and see whether you can execute your game plan and your strategy effectively at that point and not try to force the wrong shot at the wrong time or try to get the cheap out or the quick winner, etc. Laura, I know you had some to share as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think just one of the takeaways for me was that kind of traffic light system that we spoke about. Like if you're an amateur player or a junior player, how much of your training is in that kind of amber grind zone and how much of it is in red and how much of it is in green. And I know from my own personal experience, as I said, let's not spend too much time in the amber. Let's kind of pick up the pace, pick up the intensity a little bit and go into the red. And then let's also make sure that we're hitting in the recovery of the green. So at the moment, if you're spending, let's call it 5 days out of the 7 in the amber, let's switch that to 3 days and add a red in and add a green in, something like that. And I think it's just getting back to that mentality of if you're on a court and you're trying to run at your absolute max, let's call it a nice round 100 miles an hour, so it's just easier, then don't train at 80 and try and constantly be pushing for 100. Train at 100 so that you can hit 100, or even maybe a bit higher. You train at that higher intensity so that 100 then seems slow.
Exactly. I would think train at 110 so that, or 120, so you build that reserve, that threshold, and then when you train at 100 is still faster than anyone else. And you're like, hey, I'm at 85%.
And we know that if you are training at that 100 miles an hour or the 110, you're not going to be able to do it for as long as you would hold the 80. But hopefully, as we sort of alluded to in the chat, that people won't be able to stay with you when you're constantly pushing that threshold. And obviously then it's just how do you get into that 110, like get your ladder work done, get your speed work done, do sets that are quicker with a longer rest. I think as squash players, we do minute work, 30 rest. Well, why not do 30 work and have 3 minutes rest? Like there's certainly something. I know I shifted a bit more to that towards the end of my career, and definitely felt it in the central nervous system, as Tony was referring to. So let's just get that shift pattern working a little bit more, and I think everybody listening will benefit.
I completely agree. Well, folks, thanks for joining us. I hope you took a lot of knowledge and value out of this. I know I did. It sounds like Laura, you did as well. But we're looking forward to chatting with you again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye. Thanks for listening to Between the Lines, where world-class insight fuels the squash journey that never ends. If today's episode helped you grow, please share it with someone in your squash circle and join our community online. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and stay in the rally.